So these two presentations have been DNA for genealogy, really for beginners, and a introduction really to the Fitzpatrick DNA project. And I'll just recap some of the things we covered off yesterday. Some of you weren't here yesterday. I think Karen Leonard wasn't here. So we'll just a quick recap. With this incredible molecule called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. We talked about how it's a twisted helix-shaped molecule. And the key component, as far as genetic genealogy goes with DNA, are these nucleotide nitrogen bases, which sit across the rungs. And there are 4 of them: cytosine, guanine, adenine, thymine, only 4. And you see them referred to a lot in this sphere of study. They're really important when we come to discuss genetic mutations. And the focus of this talk has really been on Y DNA. So if you're interested in your paternal lineage, whether that's your dad's dad or your mom's dad or whoever, if you're interested in your paternal lineage, this is a remarkable key. And so yesterday, I started by talking about short tandem repeats. And once you understand what they are, it's sort of self-explanatory. So here's an example with a mutation referred to as DYS393. It's actually the first mutation you see when you get your DNA results at Family Tree DNA on the far left column. DYS393 is the first one. So it's a very well-known standard tandem repeat, short tandem repeat, I mean. And in men, it doesn't really change that much. Irishmen mostly have DYS393 equals 13, such as Ian and such as Matthew. I'm a little bit different. Mine is 14. Rob Ireland, who's with us, he's a 14 as well. So there are variations in these STRs that we can use to connect men and their ancestors and understand what point in time those connections came. It's probabilistic maths. In other words, it's statistics, and there's some very clever bits of software out there to help us understand how a group of men with different STRs may be related. And this is just one example of a piece of software by Dean McGee. And this is basically a group of DNA kits. It's the same kit number across the top as it is along the side. And the matrix shows you how 2 men are connected in time. This is a tool we use a lot. I pointed out yesterday, though, that there are some frailties with those sort of probabilistic tools. And that comes because every now and then there's odd mutations which don't seem to match the group. And I gave you an example yesterday of myself and Stephen, who's in the United States, and Brett in Australia. And when you look at my results for all money, it looks like I should be close to Stephen, but in fact, I'm not. I'm much closer to Brett. And so there's another type of Y-DNA test, which came along, it's really only come along in the last 10 years. It's referred to as next generation sequencing. That just refers to the way the instrumentation and the computational power behind the machines that do these tests has really, really improved. And so it's able to process the tests a lot more rapidly than before. It's another generation. It's like going from a Morris Minor to a Cadillac or something. I don't know, whatever you drive. So the second type of mutation I talked about yesterday was a single nucleotide polymorphism. And again, if we just demystify that language, what that means is it's a single mutation in one of those nucleotide base pairs. So in the example that I've shown you there, I've got cytosine mutating to guanine down the bottom, and that little DNA molecule there's been a change. I also briefly touched on the way we name the SNPs, the single nucleotide polymorphisms. And again, that can be a bit mysterious, and a lot of people just fall asleep right here when they see L21 and their eyes go blank, no one home. But L just stands for Leo Little, and 21 just probably means that it was the 21st mutation that Leo discovered. And once you get beyond that, and the fact that L21 was a human being at some point in time, it becomes a little easier. And so using this SNP naming, this SNP notation, it's possible to give a man who has a test, a DNA test, an advanced DNA test, like Ian, for example, a genetic address. And that line you see right at the top there is Ian's genetic address. He's part of a group we refer to as R1b. He comes down through a whole bunch of generations to a man, L21, who was the father of a man called DF13, who in turn was the father of a man called FGC 11134. Now, these three in a row are very key to Celtic and Irish history. L21 was the grandfather of many well-known subgroups of men, Celtic men, for want of a better phrase. I'll use that word Celtic liberally. I think we all know what it means. It means lots of things. And then down we progress in Ireland now. This is found in Ireland from 2000 BC. And so then a series of men lived until we reach an interesting juncture in Ian's history with BY 901. And then eventually we get to BY 12234, which is Fitzpatrick specific. I'll explain what that means as we go forward today. But really, if you see this mutation in a man, you think, wow, he is a Fitzpatrick. So this is Ian's genetic address, and he comes down to Y54500. And then you see he also has 3 private variants. So he shares this SNP, this mutation here, Y54500, with other men. But then he himself has got 3 mutations that's been found in no one else at all. He is truly unique. He gets those 3. Well, when you think about one of these mutations, you have to say a SNP probably occurs between every 1 to 3 generations. That's a useful rule of thumb. So Ian could have had all these mutations since he was born, but it's more likely that his father or his grandfather carried 1 or 2 of them, and it's infinitely likely that his sons carry all 3. But they are unique to him. If one of his sons tested, they wouldn't be recorded as private variants anymore. They'd get a name, whatever that name might be, and they'd be put on the genetic tree that we talked about yesterday. And that genetic tree is a big focus. So this is a new slide now. Those other slides you'd seen, this is a new slide for today. So these genetic trees or haplotrees are a big focus of what we do on the Fitzpatrick DNA project. And without a lie, Ian and I spend probably 20 hours a week each on this sort of work. And we are just invested in this, and we love this kind of stuff. This is like a paper trail tree, like you do on Ancestry, like you put in your grandparents and your great-grandparents, except it's a genetic tree. And so if you look, Ian is one of these Fitzpatricks down the bottom. And I'm going to point you to the first block, and there you see BY12234. It's one of a series of SNPs, mutations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them in that header block. Don't be confused by this saying BY12235 and A12383. That's the same mutation, but it's just been named 2 different ways. We talked yesterday about how scientists love to name things all sorts of different ways, and I lost my mouse. There it is. So that's been named by the big Y, and it's also been named by Astrid and Thomas Crown. So, but it's the same mutation. So there's 5 mutations in that block that might cover, it might cover 250 years, for example. And from that block, you see there are 1, 2, 3. There's BY9002. There's FT223544. Just treat it like a person. And then there's this one all by itself. So basically, out of this block came 3 branches, 3 lines, 3 men. And then you can rationalize it even further. Out of BY9002, we have 1, 2, we have another 3 lines coming out of it. And this is how we construct our genetic trees. This sort of topic will cover lots in the future. I'm just putting this up here now as an example for you to see the sort of thing that is possible. And so Ian, well, this actual tree was produced by Alex Williamson, who's an absolute genius of a man. When you consider this is just one of more than 10,000 little sub branches on his tree. Well, maybe not 10,000, but there's at least 10,000 men on there. It's quite remarkable. Alex is really a visionary, and his work is just exemplary. And he does this for everybody that wants to submit their data to him. And here he's got this little subtree that's Fitzpatrick dominated. There is one Maxwell in amongst that, and that Maxwell would have been a Fitzpatrick at some point in time. So whether that's through adoption or something else, fosterage, who knows? But we can tell that that marker is Fitzpatrick specific. So when I say Fitzpatrick specific marker, that's what I'm referring to. That tree by Alex Williamson, incidentally, has now been reproduced in a slightly different format at Family Tree DNA. And if you're a member of Family Tree DNA, you can access what's called, they call it their block tree for obvious reasons. And you can see it's a pretty similar format. It's got the genetic address for the subgroup along the top there, and then it's got these blocks with the SNPs in there. It doesn't give you the names of the people, so it's more private than Alex's tree. And an additional feature is it tells you how many SNPs, how many mutations deep each block is, which is really useful when you come to figure out when those blocks originated in time. We're going to cover that in a later session. Okay, I just wanted to just discuss briefly that the history of Y-DNA testing. I think it's important to understand the background of where we come from when we test, to understand where we are going and where we might be headed, because we might be headed for some interesting places with FTDNA. So one of the great pioneers of the early Y-DNA testing was James Sorensen, and he worked with a guy at Brigham Young University called Scott Woodward. And if James Sorensen was alive today, and if he saw that tree, he'd probably think all of his dreams had come true, because he was a tremendous philanthropist and he invested heavily into the pioneering genetic work that we see really improved a lot today. And his idea was to connect the entire human race by genetic testing. So if he saw that tree, I think he'd really be quite happy. And so they worked with his organization, Sorensen Molecular Genetic Foundation, and they were really one of the pioneers in early genetic testing through a company called Sorensen Genomics. Okay, Family Tree DNA came along at a similar time. Bennett Greenspan, Max Blanfield, particularly Bennett, and Jim Warren, they were part of a Jewish community that were interested in using DNA to find Jewish groups like the Cohens. And so they got very interested in DNA testing for genealogy at the same time as Sorensen. If you ever see reference to relative genetics, that's just the business unit that was set up by Sorensen. And in 2001, Sorensen began to acquire other smaller genetic testing groups, such as Gene Tree DNA. DNA Heritage UK, some of us will be aware of. I was involved with them, and they formed in 2003. And another group that you might be aware of was, I'm actually missing part of my screen here, but it was some German paternity testing company. I can't remember what they were called, but it was run by Astrid and Thomas Kahn, and they in 2006 were bought out by Family Tree DNA. And those two people, Astrid and Thomas, were very key in how Family Tree advanced. Ancestry.com got involved in 2007 when they bought out Relative Genetics. And then DNA Heritage was bought by Family Tree DNA in 2011. Ancestry continued to grow, and Ancestry become the leaders really in autosomal testing. At least they got the biggest database. And then a very recent development is Gene by Gene, which is the parent company for Family Tree DNA. They've just merged. Effectively, it was a buyout by the Australian genomics company MyDNA. So Family Tree DNA, who our project is with, has been acquired by an Australian company who are interested in medical health and genetics for health. So that's why I made the comment, who knows where Family Tree DNA is going? That's a conversation perhaps for another day. Okay. And what about...
Can I just butt in right there? It might be a good place. There's a question by Tracy here.
Yeah.
And so we wouldn't have the BY1223 as we're on a different haplotree. Can you see that question there? And just while you're looking at that, this is a really great book if you're interested in the history of the genetic testing. It's a really accessible and interesting book.
Maybe we'll send that round as a link post presentation. Okay. I can't see the chat, Esther.
Okay, so the question is from Tracy. Would you like to ask the question?
Yes, so I was just going back to you talking about the mutations, and you were saying the BY1223 is common for the Fitzpatrick name. And if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, it's also connected to your haplotree. So because we are on a different haplotree, we're not on the R, we wouldn't have that mutation, even though we Fitzpatricks. Am I understanding it correctly?
Absolutely, 100%, Tracy. And as this talk progresses today, you'll see how, if you could travel back and with Dr. Who in a time machine to 50 years ago, you pick up a book about Fitzpatricks, and it pretty much had one narrative that we all came from one place, we're all related, yada, yada, yada. And as this talk progresses today, you'll understand there's more than 60 lines. Yeah. There's more than 60. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Yeah, so you're different. You're a Fitzpatrick. You're one of us. And that's why we have as one of our statements as a society, we are diverse and yet we are one. We share a great name. So yeah, we'll cover that off in a little while. So yeah, back to the Fitzpatrick DNA project, which was the brainchild really of a visionary, a nuclear scientist, a brilliant woman, a brilliant mathematician, Colleen Fitzpatrick, who, as I said, had the vision in 2002 to be reading about genetic testing and what was happening in that world, and to say to herself, wow, wouldn't it be cool to have a surname-specific project for Fitzpatricks? And so Colleen initiated that and was one of the first surname projects. And it really prospered and really did well under Colleen's leadership. After the sale by Relative Genetics to FTDNA in 2011, we continued to go forward. Seamus Brennan, who's based in California, he's a brilliant historian. He's a remarkable man. He's a good genetic genealogist. He became the administrator in 2016. I became the administrator in 2018, and then Ian was added in 2020. So that's a little bit of background about the project. Now you might not be able to read that, but this is the aims and the visions of the project as they stand today. So why are we doing what we do? Well, we're here. It's a project for Fitzpatrick and related surnames such as Patrick and Kilpatrick. We're trying to connect other Fitzpatricks, and we're trying to determine the location of major Fitzpatrick homelands in Ireland to understand that group of 60. Secondly, we're here because we want to also understand the deeper origins and understand the pre-surname connections. And that's why on the Fitzpatrick project, you'll see there are other surnames. I mentioned yesterday the Islands, who are from Scotland. And the Islands are close relatives, as Rob down the bottom. It's quite remarkable. When I first started to see the connections between my DNA and the Islands, I understood that was from around about 800 AD, before the age of surnames. And something was happening in Ireland at that stage that made what became the Island clan flee to Scotland. There was probably Vikings came and they thought, we're not doing this. We're going to go live in Scotland. So off they went and they lived over there. But obviously they retained their identity, and their surname became, even though they were living near Dumfries, their surname became Ireland. And then they came back to Ireland in the 1600s. So it's a really cool story. And so we're intimately interested in those other surnames as well, because they teach us about our Fitzpatricks. In fact, I'm going to be too bold to say is in many cases, you're not going to be able to understand your origins, your clan origins, unless you understand those other names. And finally, we have an autosomal part of the project as well, which is managed by Karen Fitzpatrick Hall as a co-administrator. It's not that Ian and I aren't interested in autosomal DNA. We are. It's a fascinating beast all by itself, but it can be really frustrating. I find searching for hours and hours for autosomal DNA matches drives me nuts. Okay, here's a bit of a statistical review of where we're at in January 2021 with the project. You can see that we've got around about 565, about 570 members now. Not all are active. Some members came in a long time ago and they've been lost. I think the project numbers, if you look at the big Y, if you look at the autosomal, if you look at the 111 and 67 marker tests, we're probably sitting around 300 to 400 active members. So it's a good sized surname project. The growth, it just keeps growing and growing and growing. So there's a little bit of a plot about how the project is active, and we will continue to grow. There's a huge amount of interest in genetic genealogy. Yeah, and looking back, just briefly, I want to recap where we've come from and where we've gone. So I talked about Colleen when she started the project in 2002. She reported 13 members with 26 Y STR markers. It's kind of remarkable that she was able to do anything with this now, because I look at that and I think, wow, there wasn't really much data. But what Colleen could observe is that there was a group from Leash, there was a group from Down, there was a group from Cavan who seemed to be grouped together. There was a few other little groups that she couldn't really do anything with. There was a guy called Edward Fitzpatrick, who I've called County Edward, because he was way off all by himself. These little dots are genetic distance lines. Okay, so view this as in terms of how far away I am genetically. So there's a bit of a cluster here, and then one guy all by himself. 2 years later, the project had grown to 55 members, and Colleen was able to do a lot more. She was now able to add County Clare and County Cork into the mix. She added in surnames, as well as having Edward. She also had people with the surname Moore, people with the surname Shirar. And you can see the complexity of this little map we call a cladogram is increased. This was an old way of viewing and understanding Y-DNA data. In 2007, the project had grown to about 103 members, and Colleen reported 9 clades, or 9 different groups. One seemed to be based in Clare, one in Cork, one in Down, one in Leash, and then she had the names, Edward, the surname Moore, the surname Shearer. She added the surname Stanley, and Cavan had changed into the 9 of clades. And people quite often ask me what that 9 of clades was. It was just a 9th group, and Colleen, I don't think, knew what to call it, because it was called Cavan, but what Colleen found is that people with this genetic marker were also found outside of Cavan, a long way away, and Cork and Kerry. So that geographic description of the group no longer worked. At the same time, Colleen was grappling with naming these groups and figuring out where they were. Other genetic genealogists around the world were doing the same thing. And a guy called David Wilson identified that many men in the northwest of Ireland had a particular STR signature, and they were called Irish type 1. Out of that came the whole I descend from Nile of the 9 hostages theory and debate, which is largely debunked now. Also out of that came a large study by Trinity College. And then other scientists got involved. Ken Nortveld found a group that he called Irish type 2. In other words, many men in the south of Ireland and Munster, they seem to have this characteristics, DNA signature. And then the Dalcassians were identified as Irish type 3. A group in Leinster, or close to the Irish Sea, were identified. And another group called Irish type 4 was then identified. And this is all happening around about 2005, 2006, 2007. So people were starting to be able to group men together and give them definitions based on location, or ancestry. But now, if you fast forward to 2021, we're now much, much better at identifying groups using the SNPs I referred to earlier. So next generation sequencing has enabled us to really tightly define who are the Irish groups, okay? And there's many. It was a little bit problematic for the Fitzpatrick project because only 2 of those 9 groups that I put up before were strongly associated with what scientists were saying with the Irish models. Hello? Sorry, I'll carry on. I thought I heard someone say something. So for example, now we know that the Irish type 1 that was referred to is identified with a SNP called M222. We know that Irish type 2 is identified by CTS 4466. Irish type 3, which is associated with the descendants of Brian Boru, and Conor O'Brien, Baron Inchquin, carries this mutation L226. The Irish C, we know, is associated with a SNP called L159, etc. What I'm saying is we've gotten very good at identifying groups of men, the clans they're associated with, their location in Ireland, with particular genetic markers. Now, talking about the Fitzpatrick DNA Project 2021, I said to Tracy earlier, we've identified around about 60 different groups, okay? There are 8 larger groups with 10 or more members, and here they are. And we'll speak to this diversity in future meetings. But just to quickly summarize, we have Fitzpatricks who are Irish type 1. We have Fitzpatricks who are Irish type 2. In fact, there are 2 groups of Irish type 2, and they have a Fitzpatrick surname from the 1500s. We have Ian's group, which is this BY12234 I mentioned earlier, and we now know that they've got an ancient Fitzpatrick surname, and they're probably from Breffni. We have another large group, which happens to be my group, which is associated with BY2849, and we have an ancient Fitzpatrick surname, and we're associated with Leinster, even though a lot of us are in County Down. Before that, we were in Leinster. We have a big, very well-known group that Ian referred to before, A1488, which is associated with the Barons of Upper Austria. And if you read my latest article in the journal, I consider that line is also associated with a clerical lineage. We have another group in Cavan, which is L513. And then we have a big group in the southeast, which also has an ancient Fitzpatrick surname, but they're a little different. They're haplotype I. And I don't know whether that's what you're referring to before, Tracy, whether that's your group. Yeah, that's you. Well, that's a really big group in the south of Ireland, and they're either ancient Irish or Norse, and they've had that surname for a long time. So it just goes to show we have 8 big groups, all with Fitzpatrick surnames and unconnected to each other in the past 3,000 or 4,000 years. And yet we all carry the name. It's just remarkable. As well as those 8 major groups, we have all these minor groups. And I won't go through them all, but you'll see that the majority are L21. But we have quite a few Z253 groups. We have this group here, which is Matthew's group, which also has an ancient Fitzpatrick surname. We have some really interesting groups. We have an L513 group that are really strongly related to Clan Maguire. And the Maguires were big in Fermanagh and Cavan. And there was a very famous guy historically called Gilpatrick Maguire. And we think that maybe his sons became called McGilpatricks, and then eventually became Fitzpatricks because of the strong genetic connections they have with Maguires. So these are some of the smaller groups. We have a really emerging, really interesting U106 group from down south from Wexford. And that's almost like a genetic signature, but they're also an old Fitzpatrick group. We've got a bunch of other a bunch. I mean, 22 groups of individuals really, who we don't know how to group, but they're basically a Celtic Irish extraction. We've got another couple of, or few of Irish groups. We have one guy from Japan. We have one African, we have one Levantine, and one indigenous American Fitzpatrick. So it just goes to show how truly diverse we are. And yet we were all Fitzpatricks. It's kind of cool. Right, I thought I'd finish today just on a practical note and give you a little case study, because you might be thinking, wow, this is all kind of cool, all this ancient stuff, and what does it mean for me? Well, if I give you a case study, it might get you thinking, well, maybe that's possible, that I can use DNA to do something like this for my family as well. It takes a lot of work, but never lose hope, because DNA is a remarkable tool. I'm going to talk to you about Ron Fitzpatrick, who's in California, and he traced his Fitzpatricks to the 1850s in Albany, to a guy called Patrick Fitzpatrick, who was a tailor. And he knew from census records and from a will that Patrick had a brother called Matthew. But at the 37 marker level, Ron had very, very few matches. He did have a match to Ian Fitzpatrick, not the Ian, there's another Ian who lives in Cheshire. And the match was fairly close, but Ian had no idea in Ireland where his people were from. So both Ron and Ian were lost. They knew they were Irish, they knew they were Fitzpatricks, but they had no idea about where they were from. And I know there's many in that category. You've got few matches, you might not match Fitzpatricks. And that was Ron's situation when he first tested, say, 15 years ago. What I noticed about Ron, though, is he had that signature I was talking about earlier, which many Fitzpatricks in County Down have. DYS 393 equals 14, which is what I am as well. And so I remember saying to Ron and Ian, I think you guys might be from County Down, because that mark is pretty unique. And so that's where we started to look. And so we started to look for Patrick Fitzpatrick's in County Down, which is like the most stupidest thing you could ever try to do, because there's just too many of them. So we gave up on that idea. That was a stupid idea. What I began to do, though, when I became administrator of the Fitzpatrick Project, I began to review old data. And I found some markers for Robert Fitzpatrick that looked pretty similar to Ron's, but Robert sadly had passed away. And so I couldn't get him to upgrade his test. I just knew that he had this marker DYS 393 equals 14, and he was possibly related to Ron. But the intriguing thing is that Robert traced the clawhead in County Louth, definitively, absolutely. He had a brilliant paper trail back to a guy called Nicholas. So my mind starts to go, okay, Ron, you might not be from Down, you might be from Louth, which sort of blew my mind. I mean, Louth and Down, as you know, are next to each other as counties. And there's a lot of Fitzpatricks in the south of Down, but there's not many Fitzpatricks in the north of Louth. The Fitzpatricks in Louth are from down south, way down south. So, geographically, there was a disconnect in my mind that we could be related to those people. And so I'd found a potential link for Ron into County Louth. So what did I do next? Because Robert had passed away, and I'd emailed his family to say, is there anybody else that would like to take a DNA test? And that didn't work. And this is where we must be as dogged as we can. So what I did is I went on Ancestry.com and I looked for Nicholas Fitzpatrick and other people that might be researching him. And I found Renee Fitzpatrick Wilson in America. And I emailed Renee and I said, hey, Renee, you descend from Nicholas as well. I told her the story. I said, have you got any males in your family that might like to take a DNA test? And she said, yeah, I got my dad, I got my brother. And so we got Renee's dad tested for 37 markers, and bang, it was a really great match with Ron and Ian. And so I said to those guys, I think I found what county in Ireland you're from. I think you're from County Louth. And they were just like, wow. after so many years of trying to find where they were from, they now knew which county they were from in Ireland, which was a big deal. And I still feel a bit emotional about it because it's a great moment. So what we did next is we had other people join the project, and Mary Lish, I'm not sure whether Mary's with us today, but Mary's Brian Fitzpatrick is her dad, I think, or brother. And Mary didn't really know where she was from either. But I said to Mary, well, you guys are from County Louth. I'll talk about Ethna in a minute, but let's just carry on the story about Ron, because once you know that Patrick Fitzpatrick, a tailor, is from County Louth, and then once you figure out where the County Louth Fitzpatricks live, it then frees you up to really go hard out looking at the genealogical records. So I went hard out looking at records, and I hit absolute gold. This is a paper from the Journal of County Louth Archaeological History Society, and there he is. That's Ron's man, Patrick Fitzpatrick Taylor. This family went to America. He has his home from his brother Matthew, and there's Matthew, Patrick's brother. This family went to America. But I didn't have the confidence to do that without the DNA test telling me that Ron's Patrick, the tailor that went to America, was from Louth. I never would have looked in these records. And so that's a really cool little case study as to how we can use DNA to open up the historical records for us. I mentioned Ethna because what is also really important to do, just to round off this case study, is when I went to Ireland, and the last time I was there was 2019, and I went to Clawhead. I hadn't met Ethna, but I went in search of Fitzpatrick's, because if you can find living Fitzpatrick's in the area where you might trace to, that is just fantastic. And we managed to get a DNA test done on Ethna's uncle Bill, and he matched Ron, and he matched Rennie's dad, and so it rounded off the story. We went from not knowing where they were from to DNA giving us a clue, to finding some historical records, to then going back into Ireland to a village, a little village on the coast, finding someone locally and matching them up with their cousins, their long lost cousins in the United States. And for me, it doesn't really get any better than that. It's just a complete joy and privilege to be able to do that for people. And I hope we can do it for you. We'll try. So I'm gonna just close this off now for some questions. But what's next for our presentations? I think end of March, at the latest end of April, we'll have Ian Fitzpatrick come in and talk about his group. And now that you've got a little bit of background on the DNA, and we'll put these presentations up on the YouTube channel so you can view them again. Now that you've got a little bit of background, you won't be so lost in the language, in the lingo. So Ian will talk about his people. I'll go on and talk about this group that I'm part of. And then we'll talk about the very, very interesting descendants of the Barons of Upper Ossory. We'll also touch on some of the Cavan Fitzpatricks. I'd love to talk about some of the Southeast Island Fitzpatricks who might be on Morfardrakes. I'd love to talk about the Maguires, and I'd love to talk about this emerging group of L226. That's probably a program for the next year to 18 months. But come end of March, end of April, we'll have another talk. And